I have a new paper title. It's called Is Saints Credible History? So if any of you want to go to the other session, you're free to do that now. If this isn't the paper you want to hear. The account of the Mormon Exodus I will discuss today is found in Saints Volume 2, called The Story of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So this is no unhallowed hand. Let's see, let me get the... Okay. There we go. This 4-volume history presents itself as an official history of the church. The marks of officialdom are obvious to the reader. The title page lists no author, and the imprimatur has the church's name. In Volume 1, a frontispiece signed by the First Presidency endorses the series. The church makes a great effort to promote these books to members. A poster advertising the latest volume can be found on the bulletin board of every meeting house. Saints also has its own portal on the church's Gospel Library app, which means that the books are available to church members in over a dozen languages. Saints wants to be seen as an institutional history. But the series also wants to be seen as a work of scholarship and academic history. Institutional histories often lack a source trail. Saints does not. The endnotes in Saints display impressive archival research, and the works cited lists hundreds of sources, both primary and secondary. All the archival sources found in the Church History Library have been digitized, that is, those cited in Saints, allowing readers of the online edition to click a link and read the actual document. This is quite an amazing feature if you haven't read Saints online. All of this apparatus sends an important message to readers. Don't take the institution's word for it. Here are the sources, go and read them. This ideal of free inquiry, of course, lies at the heart of the university's project. If the Saints series wants to represent the church, it aspires on some level also to represent the university. The life of the mind and the life of the spirit are brought together under one cover. This merger of institutional and academic history generates at least two sets of questions about the Mormon Exodus. The first set has to do with credibility. Can the account of the Exodus in Saints be trusted? In popular imagination, of course, institutional history is untrustworthy history. That's because faith in institutions is probably at its lowest ebb right now in American history. In an effort to preserve its power, according to this story, the institution and those who lead it cannot possibly bear to tell the full truth. Embarrassing details and challenging episodes are covered over or minimized, shielding the institution from reproach. What makes us think that Saints is anything different? Another set of questions has to do with the controversial elements in the Exodus story. If Saints aspires to credibility, how does it deal with difficult questions? How much did Brigham Young and other church leaders know about where they were going? What about slavery along the trek west? And how does the account in Saints deal with death at winter quarters? First, I would like to defend the credibility of Saints, and then I will address controversial elements, 3 of them, comparing Saints against past institutional histories. There are many ways that scholarly works establish their credibility. One of the most important is the author's name on the title page. The presence of a name tells readers that the author is willing to stake his or her reputation on the contents of the book. Faulty scholarship can doom the author's career, the chance for tenure is dashed, and the author's reputation is ruined, never to be recovered. An author's name does not guarantee credibility, but it makes it more likely than anonymous works. For an institution, the presence of an author's name, though, can actually undermine credibility. The work can be passed off as just one person's opinion, not as views representing the institution as a whole. Institutional history, then, starts with a credibility disadvantage. It needs an author's name in order to establish its credibility, but if it includes that name, it risks undermining the very credibility it seeks. Saints solves this dilemma by including a contributors page in the front matter of every book. Now, I don't have a PowerPoint slide on this, but you can find this right at the outset. Okay, there it is. Right after the title page, all the principal contributors are listed on 2 pages. The critical thing to notice about this list is that the driving force behind Saints, the historians and the editors, are all academics with scholarly lives outside of Saints. The managing historian has a Ph.D. in history. Steve Harper, who's here today, preceded me, and then myself. All 4 general editors have Ph.D.s in English or history. Like a single-authored scholarly monograph, these scholars have reputations to lose. If Saints is panned, they are panned. The presence of known scholars on the contributors page allows Saints to establish its own credibility as institutional history. A similar function is performed in the back matter, where the acknowledgments page thanks a long list of some 30 expert readers who reviewed the manuscript or parts of it. The names include top scholars in the field of Mormon history: Kathy Danes, Richard Bushman, Terrell Givens, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and our very own Dick Bennett, and many others. These reviewers do not, of course, endorse every word of the book any more than any other reviewers do, but their presence conveys the message that Saints has received top-flight criticism during its production. It is not a flimsy work. A cynic might say that scholars are under the thumb of church leaders, doing only what they are told to do. This narrative is false. Church leaders have not instructed the scholars how to write Saints. They do not send down a list of directives on what to include and what to exclude. The scholars conceptualize, outline, locate characters, research, write, and revise. They develop their own list of expert reviewers and incorporate feedback from these reviewers. Only afterwards do church authorities review. At the very end of the process, the First Presidency reads the manuscript, offers their feedback, and this feedback has most certainly improved the books. I can testify to that. But the Presidency is not stage managing the operation. None of the characters or story arcs picked out by the scholars that are published in the first 2 volumes and the 3rd volume, which is now in translation, were asked to be cut. The same is true of correlation, the department charged with making sure that all published curriculum is in sync and in line with church doctrine and practice. Once again, the cynic imagines correlation to be something like the Politburo, a heavy-handed censor board. This too is false. In reality, the interaction with correlation is a negotiation as much as it is with the comments of other reviewers. Correlation reads the manuscript and offers suggestions for improvement on the level of sentence, word, or phrase, not really on whether a scene should be there or not. Some of the recommendations are implemented and some are not. Where we differ, we sit down and we discuss our differences, typically meeting somewhere in the middle, in a place satisfactory to both parties. In my 3 years as managing historian, I've enjoyed a cordial relationship with correlation and have never felt that the scholarly integrity of the volumes has been compromised because of that result. The most common criticism of Saints is that the writing is too simplistic. But simplicity is more a matter of scale than credibility. The scholar who writes mainly for other scholars has a different scale and can therefore say different things than a church whose readership differs so much in age, education, and cultural background. Now, in the process of drafting Saints, I would often give draft chapters to my 8-year-old daughter, and I would say, "Do you understand this? What don't you understand?" And she would come back and say, "I read it, and it's not even boring." Moreover, simple need not equate to false. The parables of Jesus can be understood by both children and scholars, but no one would say that they lack credibility simply because children can comprehend them. Like the parables, the saint's style has layers of complexity, not always apparent on first reading, as I will demonstrate at the end of the paper. Finally, a word about objectivity. In the popular mind, credibility is sometimes equated with objectivity as though such a thing were possible. No academic historian today believes it is possible. The historical profession once aspired to objectivity, but the natural sciences are no longer a model for the humanities as they once were. The old subject-object split has been the subject of withering criticism for at least half a century. And today, most historians would grant that they cannot hope to rid themselves entirely of some conscious or unconscious bias. Bias today is actually more acceptable than it probably ever was, if the new woke orthodoxy at universities is any measure. If bias is inevitable, we can at least aspire to fairness. As an institutional history, Saints does aspire to fairly represent all kinds of people. Without a doubt, it is the most diverse collection of voices ever assembled in the Church's official history. Women, children, people of all races, and even apostates command scenes of their own. Now to the controversial elements. They're best assessed by comparing Saints and the way Saints tells the story against other institutional history. First, let's look at what the Saints knew about what they were doing or where they were going. In Church History in the Fullness of Times, the 1989 Institute Manual that Saints has since replaced, the emphasis is on the role of prophecy and revelation in deciding on a location. The manual confidently observes that Joseph Smith had prophesied in 1842 that the Saints would be driven to the Rocky Mountains and there become a mighty people. And this is a framework for understanding the Exodus that has been in place for probably 100 years or more, using this Joseph Smith prophecy. In this telling, Brigham Young was simply carrying out the prophecy of his predecessor. The Saints didn't know the exact location. They only knew, in the Institute Manual's words, that their elders had received revelation to locate a refuge somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. The emphasis is on revelation. Now, Saints doesn't, of course, discount this idea, but it never cites the supposed prophecy of Joseph Smith, not because it may not be accurate, but because it is a second-hand observation given years later, after Salt Lake City had already become great and mighty. It is therefore under suspicion. And in the years since the manual was written, better records have come to light. Saints quotes the Council of 50 Minutes, which were discovered in the course of publishing the Joseph Smith papers. They have Brigham Young saying in Nauvoo that he wanted to settle in the Great Basin, in a desert, or the place between the mountains. That was his language. If we settle in a land that no white man wants, Young says, there will be no jealousies from any nation. After all, they were trying to escape the conflicts that came with living in the United States. Since Young understood that the land was inhabited by Native Americans, this was actually more of an appeal than a drawback, since the Saints felt obligated to preach and convert the Indians, whom they believed to be a remnant covenant, or a covenant remnant, of the house of Israel. Saints also emphasizes the contingency and uncertainty of the journey. Other alluring possibilities for settlement emerge along the way, forcing Brigham Young to make a decision. We see Young collecting information on the Bear River Valley from explorers like Moses Hunt and Jim Bridger. We see him hearing the case for California made by Sam Brannan. Nothing is decided in advance as it is in church history in the fullness of times. Saints is driven by a Brigham found in the primary sources, not the Joseph found in the secondary sources. Second is the problem of race. As a narrative history, Saints tells the story of people told from the point of view of individual people. There's no single overarching editorial voice as there was for past institutional histories, and this has caused trouble for some readers. They just don't like, they want the institution to tell them what to believe. The Exodus is told from the perspective of more than a dozen different voices. This collection of voices can be bewildering to some readers, and Saints has been criticized for having too many characters and voices. These people have not read Leo Tolstoy. Saints is more like modern television with its multiple threads and interweaving of characters. Cultural critics have observed that classic television, like MASH, for example, thrives mostly on the witticism of its characters, asking little of the viewer. Modern television, by contrast, requires much more cognitive energy on the part of the viewer. There are many more points of view characters. The POV may oscillate between good guys and bad guys. And in the modern genre, even the idea of good and bad is complicated. Sometimes the good guys do bad things and vice versa. The plot lines are more numerous and more complex, and there is not always a clean, satisfactory ending, as there was in the classic television genre. The main advantage of having so many voices in Saints is that it allows the books to cover so much experiential ground. So racially diverse characters can be woven into the fabric of the book, as it is with Jane Manning James, who is a free black woman whose story we tell in the Exodus. Neither B.H. Roberts' comprehensive history, which is the last multi-volume history of the church, nor Church History in the Fullness of Time said anything about slavery or black people, black members along the trek west. Saints broaches it for the first time in an official church history in a scene told from the POV of Jane Manning James, whom I just mentioned. The scene mentions that slaveholders and some slaves had been baptized and that 3 enslaved Latter-day Saints were members of the advance company, Green Flake, Harkley, and Oscar Crosby. But lest the reader suppose that all Latter-day Saints were of one voice on the question of slavery, the text mentions the anti-slavery of other members and quotes D&C 101 to the effect that it is not right that any man should be in bondage one to another. In other words, Saints acknowledges enslavement but shows disagreement among the pioneers, and it also sends a message to modern-day saints. The church does not endorse what these saints did in enslaving black members. So there's a duty to teach current-day members, but also a duty to teach the history as it was lived in 1846-47. The text lays the groundwork for later priesthood and temple restrictions, that is, discussions of them, which began in 1852 by observing that some saints had already begun to teach, this is the quote from Saints, teach the false idea that black skin was evidence of a person's unrighteous actions in the premortal life. This is one of the rare moments where Saints slips into an editorial voice, calling the idea of equating skin color with unrighteousness false. And this is according to current church teaching. The point here is that the book does not shy away from uncomfortable history. Finally, the problem of death in winter quarters. And I'll conclude with this. And I have B.H. Roberts writing on this in 1930. Now, all the official histories admit that there was great suffering among the saints in 1846-47 right here in winter quarters. And this is concerning to some writers, like B.H. Roberts. They feel like they have to explain it, because after all, if you're moving all of these people and you're going to a place of refuge, why are people dying? This is a question that B.H. Roberts feels like he has to answer. Here's what he says. Notice the editorializing. After he's discussed the death, he says, fortunately, the saints passed through the trying experiences of all and the winter of 1846 without being hardened in their spirits. And undoubtedly, sorrows that do not harden tend to sanctification of the heart of man, broaden his sympathies, and make him more quickly responsive to the woes of others, prepare him truly for brotherhood with his fellows. Is that the explanation of these afflictions which visited the saints in their Missouri River camps? Now, Church History in the Fullness of Times, it has a paragraph here that you can read. I don't have time to read it, but basically where they lay out the problems. Over 700 people died, so it's very factual. But then right after that paragraph, it follows it up. It tries to mitigate it by saying, but all was not sorrow, especially in winter quarters. Life there could still be generally pleasant, rewarding, and meaningful. Brigham Young encouraged the wards to celebrate with feasts and dancing. Women often came together in neighborhood groups to gather food, quilt, braid straw, comb each other's hair, knit, wash clothes, and read letters. So this is a way of helping the reader feel better about what happened at winter quarters. Now notice how Saints does it, and this is where I want to conclude. Some of the challenges at winter quarters and other temporary settlements were impossible to avoid. By the time cold weather set in, over 9,000 Saints lived in the area, including 3,500 who lived in winter quarters. Accidents, sickness, and death plagued every settlement. So there's an attempt in Saints to say no settlement was immune. Malaria, tuberculosis, scurvy, other illnesses claimed about 1 person in 10. So even more specific, instead of saying 700, we actually help the reader visualize it's actually 1 in 10. That sounds a lot more prevalent than 700. About half of the deceased were infants and children. So this tugs at your heart, but it's not buried or covered over. Wilford Woodruff's family suffered along with the others. So here we have an attempt to show that apostles, high church leaders were not immune from death. In October, while Wilford cut timber, a falling tree struck him and broke some of his ribs. Soon after, his little son Joseph caught a severe cold. Wilford and Phoebe attended to the boy constantly, but nothing they did helped, and soon they buried his body in the settlement's newly plotted cemetery. Some weeks after Joseph's death, Phoebe delivered a baby prematurely, and the child died 2 days later. One evening, Wilford came home and found Phoebe distraught, looking at a portrait of herself holding Joseph. Losing the children pained them both, and Wilford longed for what the saints would find, when the saints would find a home, live in peace, and enjoy the blessings and safety of Zion. I pray my heavenly Father to lengthen out my days, he wrote in his journal, to behold the house of God stand upon the tops of the mountains, and to see the standard of liberty reared up as an ensign to the nations. Now here, I hope you can see that we let the story of Wilford and Phoebe tell the story of suffering. There's no attempt to explain why this happened. It's unexplainable. We don't do a B.H. Roberts. We don't say, well, but everything was okay. What we do is we let Wilford's faith carry the day. So he had these bad things that happened in his family, and yet he could still pray to lengthen out my days. He still had faith ultimately in God's redemptive plan, not only for the church, but for his own family. This is how Saints works. It allows people to tell the story. I hope that you spread the word that Saints can be trusted as reliable and credible history. Thanks.